So I'm Joe Robertson. I'm the Global Strategy Director for CCL. I was one of the first volunteers in the Northeast, started a group in New Jersey and volunteered with CCL for years before getting involved in what I do now for CCL. I would describe that work as trying to develop a global strategy and give people around the world something to do to implement it. We have groups on 5 continents outside of North America that I work with and coordinate. And I also do the work that CCL does inside the United Nations negotiating process, World Bank and IMF, sort of international economic and financial planning policy processes. And we're trying to make sure that we can bring all the values that CCL has into that global space. So that would be my introduction, I guess, to me. I call this climate geopolitics partly because I was once asked to describe that 2-word phrase, but I think that it's also important for us to remember whenever we talk about climate policy, whenever we talk about what the US Congress wants to do or any given country wants to do, that this really is something that will affect people in other places. And so we don't have the luxury of deciding these policies the way that we would decide, you know, what the fine should be for a parking ticket or something like that. This is not just local, it's something that has real impacts everywhere. Climate disruption is geopolitical insecurity. This is something that is now on the radar. It has been on the radar for a long time, but the UN Security Council has now met many times over the last couple of years, specifically on climate-related issues. And to look at how climate disruption is actually creating conditions for intense and uncontrollable conflicts. Here's just an example. You see the World Resources Institute put this map together of intense water stress across this particular part of the Middle East. And you see the red areas of Syria. You can see along the western border of Syria and also in the Northeast. And I just want to show you, I mean, look at how those red areas of the most intense water scarcity correspond to the green parts of this map. Almost perfectly. The ability of Syria to grow food has collapsed over the last 15 years. And the inability of people to make a living in the traditional economy of the country or to be able to support their families given the effect on prices is creating a total system failure across the country and across the region. And we're seeing more and more of this, not just in Syria, but in many places around the world, where the natural processes we expect will underpin what we take to be society, meaning something that exists and is institutional and can go on, those things go away, and then society goes from being, you know, cities with people making a living to giant refugee camps where people don't have a way to make a living and they need help. And this creates a cycle of violence that spreads around it. So this is something that people are really paying attention to in terms of the global process. A couple of years ago, we thought we would be looking at this kind of map in 2065. If we did nothing, we might be looking at, you know, Arctic temperatures. You see the red, it corresponds to 11 to 16 degrees above normal in 2065. The complication there is that that's far more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. The 1.5 degrees to stay alive movement operates on the knowledge that science shows us that at that level of warming, countries are going to disappear under the water. So we can't let it get there. And in the Paris talks last year, that message got through. In the middle of the conference, people began to understand that industrialized countries signed up to this thing that they had always sort of opposed as being maybe too much ambition to be doable. Here's where we actually are now, though. So we go back to that map from 2065, 11 to 16 degrees warming. This is a bad, bad scenario. Svalbard is in northern Norway. It's in the center of this globe, but it's in northern Norway. So what you're looking at is the Arctic. It's in the Arctic Ocean, And it's so cold in Svalbard that that's where the world has collectively decided to put our global seed bank. That's where we're protecting biodiversity for the future by keeping things cold under the ground. This is January 24th of 2016 at 5:41 p.m. It was 37 degrees Fahrenheit, the high of 39 that day in Svalbard. And during January and February, the temperatures in the Arctic were unbelievably out of the norm. This is the actual map of February 2016 as an anomaly compared to the historic norm. In January and February, temperatures were an average of 11 degrees Celsius warmer. In Svalbard, they were as much as 30 degrees warmer Fahrenheit throughout January. Ice was seen melting in the Arctic Ocean in the month of February by small craft explorers. These things aren't supposed to be happening. So we are now facing a true global design challenge. We need to solve this as quickly as possible. And the urgency of the situation is now better understood than ever before. Going back to how this all started, the Rio Summit in 1992, the Earth Summit, produced several different treaties. The most relevant, of course, to what we're talking about is the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. It set out a process where countries would agree to decarbonize and to eliminate harmful greenhouse gas emissions from their economic systems. The problem with the way the agreement was made was that industrialized countries were going to be required to do most of the difficult heavy lifting because they were the ones responsible historically for producing the problem. The developing countries hadn't produced the problem. They were bearing the brunt of the impacts already, and that was only going to get worse. And if they were told they couldn't develop by the only means we know how to at that time, then we weren't going to have a viable agreement. So the UN Framework Convention distinguishes between industrialized countries and those known as non-Annex 1, not the industrialized countries. This created the political problem in the United States, which was that unless we had an agreement that required all nations to act, especially China and India, which are big polluters, not historically, not 1900, 1950, 1970, but now certainly, we weren't going to have a US administration and a US Congress that could agree. And we're all familiar with that. Here's the thing. Under Article 6 of the United States Constitution, that ratified treaty, the 92 Climate Convention, the thing we're all going to go to try to implement in Marrakesh in a couple of weeks, is the supreme law of the land. Article 6 of the United States Constitution says a ratified treaty is, quote, the supreme law of the land. So it is constitutional law that the United States must meet the burden of that treaty, which is to avoid dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. It is constitutional law that we must end climate change on our own if necessary. Not every country has such a strict interpretation of treaties. And so when the Kyoto Protocol came along at the third conference of the parties to the convention, it didn't include mandatory decarbonization for China and India because that wasn't in the convention. This is why for 20 years the fight has gone on to get a universal agreement. Throughout 2014 and 2015, there was this sort of global literary workshop going on where countries were negotiating with each other over language. And it wasn't just a hard-nosed business negotiation. It was also very much, you know, a finding of fellows in terms of, do you like this kind of vocabulary? Does this seem optimistic to you? Does this seem like it can get us where we need to go? And it was also beyond that, emotional conversation. You know, are you okay if we put this comma here? How does that make you feel? And countries would actually have these stock-taking meetings where they would discuss how they feel about the process of drafting. And so this went on in an effort to get us to the Paris Agreement. Civil society organizations, UN agencies, everybody came together and gave their input. You can see Ahmed, one of the two co-chairs of the drafting committee. The other one is Dan Reef-Snyder sitting right next to him, looking very intense. There was a lot at stake, and a lot of people didn't sleep for a very long time and traveled an awful lot to try to calm everybody's fears and get to something that people could agree on. The Paris Agreement was agreed by consensus. And perhaps the biggest breakthrough of the Paris Agreement, among all the other things that it includes, is that for the first time since the 1992 Climate Convention, and that means for the first time in history, all of the nations of the world have agreed that they will take concrete domestic action to decarbonize or to develop without carbon emissions and to fight climate change. So that complaint that some of us are very familiar with, that we hear from certain elements of the political spectrum in the United States, that we can't do it alone, that the rest of the world isn't going to help out, that other big polluters aren't going to bear the responsibility, that's now completely null and void, because that agreement that they thought would never be attained has been obtained. The thing is that a lot of countries can't just do what they're promising to do. They can't just change their energy system. In the United States, we could feasibly do that. We could spend tons of money, and we could have negative growth for a while, and we could deal with the economic burden. We won't descend into civil war over that. But there are countries where if they make the wrong step, the economic disruption in their country could be so grave that they'll be at risk of being another Syria. So the question then becomes, how do you accept each country's pledge to decarbonize or to develop in a low carbon way, and then ratchet up that ambition over time? So the way the Paris Agreement works, there's a list of legal decisions made by all 195 countries plus the European Union, all together as 196 parties to the treaty. There's a list of legal decisions interpreting what things mean and setting goals. There's an agreement that describes what is this new document about what has been agreed to by consensus. And then there are the annexes. And the annexes are very important because in the Paris Agreement case, every single party, all of the countries plus the European Union, submit their own nationally determined contribution, their own national plan. And so each of those plans is going to be more or less ambitious depending on a lot of things. We're now entering into a period where there are the risks that come with not solving climate change, and there are the risks of countries guessing wrong about the policies that they're going to pursue, but there's also the risk of not going fast enough, not just to solve climate change, but also to keep up with the economy of the world. This is a process of designing the future economy of the world. So of course, here's Citizens Climate Lobby Australia at their first national conference last year. We have people all over the world that are working together to go and meet their leaders, to go and talk to these brave CCL Australia volunteers are going to meet, just days before he was actually pushed out of office, the most infamous, climate denialist head of state in the world at that time. We have people who are going to do that work. We have global climate civics interns that are joining UN processes. They're not just taking notes. You can see from Eddie's facial expression, they are figuring out how to take what's going on in front of them and turn it into a strategy for making the process better and more efficient. This kind of relationship building can happen anywhere, and it can happen in a much wider range of issue areas now than ever before. These are the Sustainable Development Goals. I share them with you because there's this really important thing that is materializing as the world decides we're going to address climate change together, which is other things have also been decided to support that. And I've thought that, in the way that we do at CCL, it's useful to kind of take something really complex and try to boil it down to something that everybody can understand. So when we talk to a lawmaker who doesn't necessarily have a deep background in macroeconomics, we can make it understandable in the context of their constituents or something like that. What the United Nations decided in 2015 was essentially what Pope Francis was calling for in his encyclical, which is just do the right thing. Do it every time. Don't ever do harm when you know you could have done something else to avoid harm. Make decisions that allow no room for poverty, no room for hunger, no room for bad health and outbreaks and irresponsible sanitation. Make sure people have opportunity to be educated. Make sure women and men both have opportunities, the same treatment before the law, but make sure boys and girls do also. Those things have all been decided in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals. We're told that while the Sustainable Development Goals recognize that people and planet are interconnected, and that the connection between people and planet is also connected to peace and security, we're told that Goal 13 is climate action. And we're going to be bringing along with us to Marrakesh this idea. You notice that the symbol for climate action is an eye. We're going to be bringing along this idea of climate visionary and give people an opportunity to tell their own vision of the future. But Goal 13 is not the only goal related to climate. Obviously, renewable energy, sustainable cities, responsible consumption, oceans, land use, these things are all related to climate. Also, the food supply, public health, air pollution, etc. Migrating mosquitoes, vector-borne diseases, and things like that, Zika. Good jobs, innovation, all these things are clearly related to climate change. So are these. Most especially if you look at this, 16 and 17, you can't have effective policy of the kind we're talking about. You can't have a fee and dividend plan. You can't have a cap and trade plan. You can't have renewable portfolio standards if you don't have peace and justice and strong civic institutions that are transparent, that are reliable, that are professional, that are independent of the whim of the executive, etc. If you don't have that, you have corruption, you have no idea what's going on. And so you need progress on that to deal with climate change. All of the goals relate to climate change. The World Resources Institute did a study that they just released about 3 weeks ago, found that of the 169 targets under the 17 goals, concrete measurable targets for progress, 147 out of 169 are directly linked to climate action in some way. And then they mapped that analysis across all of the nationally determined contributions that the countries have put forward. So what does that say to us? It says, when you have children in Syria who are growing up not going to school, and the lucky ones like these kids are in schools that have been bombed. I say lucky because others have migrated and they can't inhabit the communities they've migrated to, or they're in refugee camps where there may not be a good education opportunity, or they're just hiding out and they can't go into public places as kids. They're too vulnerable. So they're losing years and years of education. In Bangladesh, we have millions of people who have migrated to the capital of the city. There are also millions of migrants from Bangladesh who've made it all the way to Europe, which is something that's not as talked about as Syria. Think about that journey, having to travel in the way that refugees do from Bangladesh, which is east of India, all the way across Asia, and somehow into Europe. These people are being displaced by climate change directly, not just because something happened and then there's a conflict and then they're fleeing the violence. They're fleeing saltwater intrusion, the collapse of local agriculture, the flooding of coastal villages. A lot of about half the inhabitable land of Bangladesh is actually at or below sea level. So you have this huge problem in a country that doesn't necessarily get the kind of attention as a global hotspot that maybe it needs to when you think about climate change. Here's some more examples of stuff that's going on around the world. And also, incidentally, here's Citizens Climate Lobby Nepal helping out after the earthquake last year, when villagers needed medicine, they needed health checkups, they needed food, they needed clothing and blankets, they needed, tents or something that they could take shelter in. But look at some of these impacts. These are just examples, but they're very powerful examples of what we're trying to deal with that's other than just climate. In Siberia, we're now looking at the possibility that ancient anthrax has reemerged from dead animals that were buried in the permafrost that has melted. We know in Citizens Climate Lobby that if we put a fee and dividend plan in place, we can generate local economic benefits. We can raise real disposable personal income. Right now, the whole world is facing this challenge that is such a big issue in our presidential election, which is how ordinary people feel like they're being left behind by the economy. They feel like that the wealth divide is growing. That's happening globally. So there are places where lots and lots of people are being lifted out of poverty, or where lots of progress has been made, but the gap between the richest and the poorest is widening in almost every country in the world. And real disposable personal income is not lining up with economic growth the way it is expected to. And so the fact that the REMI study shows that fee and dividend can do that gives us all kinds of interesting insights. It's how we created the Pathway to Paris core principles, which tell us that we can take those virtues of an economic plan and turn them into something that can work for all kinds of people in all kinds of different places. This is a group of coal miners that came to the United States Senate back in 2014 to say, don't kill us. That was literally their message. They were saying, we're not against you doing the right thing for the environment, the right thing for public health. We just don't want you to forget that we're human beings and we have no future. And so you think about Syrian kids and their schools, you think about villages in Nepal that where for them glacial melt means the Himalayas are going to fall on top of them at any time. There are hundreds of landslides a year now in Nepal because of the melting glaciers. You think about the coal miners and the things that they're going to face. They face challenges because of coal. They face challenges because of climate policy. They also face challenges because our economy is in a state of market failure. Good news, the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition has adopted as its mission the coordinating of carbon pricing policies between all governments across the world, with a goal of bringing at least 50% of all greenhouse gas emissions under some kind of carbon price by 2025. That's a very ambitious policy goal, but it's completely doable, and the people at this table have made a lot of progress in that direction. But here's the thing. Those coal miners, the people in villages in Bangladesh, they need to be heard because they have experiences that will tell us more than briefing books and white papers can tell us about what the impacts are going to be of a policy design. In CCL, we have been very conscious of that, and the policy approach we have is not just designed to thread the needle in the US Congress and be nonpartisan and non-political. It is also designed to make sure that we don't undermine economic health and well-being, that in fact we create better conditions for it. So one of our big areas of focus in the climate negotiations is citizen engagement, partly because it's CCL's lifeblood, but also because without it, this global design process where we create a livable future together isn't really going to work. It's not going to be possible for governments to treat each other as rivals and also arrive at the best result. It's much more important for them to hear from their people who agree with each other about how important it is to have sustainable energy policy, to have sustainable international relations, to have sustainable economies in general, to have education systems that actually work for everybody. So we're looking at how do we connect all those things, and the easiest way to connect them is, instead of dictating to people how to connect them, just bring more people into the process and let them speak. So Marrakesh is the COP22. It's the 22nd conference of the parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. On the left, you see the UNFCCC logo. On the right, you see the Marrakesh COP22 logo. The CMP12 is the 12th conference of the parties serving as the meeting of the parties to the Kyoto Protocol. It's the nomenclature they used. This is also going to be the CMA1, the conference of the parties serving as the meeting of the parties to the agreement, the Paris Agreement. It's the first time that that will happen. And the Paris Agreement is entering into legal force on November 4th. This is a year and a half ahead of the original schedule. So it's tremendously exciting that that's going to be happening. And we will be there for the first time ever with a Citizens Climate Lobby official delegation. So I have the joy of being the head of the delegation, and I also have the joy of working with some really great people who are going to help us track what's going on, contribute to the conversation there, try to move some agenda items forward, and report back. We've decided to boil down our desired action items that we want the governments of the world to address to three basic ideas. Citizen engagement improves outcomes, so we should have more of it. Carbon pricing makes everything cheaper, faster, and more effective in terms of climate action, so we should have more of that. And climate resilient investment, this is really an emerging field. It's both more and less complicated than it sounds. It basically means shifting all kinds of investment, public sector, private sector, towards the things that allow for thriving climate smart economies, the kind that aren't going to be, you know, overwhelmed by climate impacts or by having to deal with climate policy. So under citizen engagement, we want to follow the Action for Climate Empowerment agenda. We want citizen participation to be made officially part of the process. It's not right now officially part of the process, but we want to create more spaces for that. We want participatory ongoing monitoring, reporting, and verification. Citizens can do that work. If you ask people in a community whether there's pollution, they can tell you. That might sound trivial because we live in a society, many of us, where that kind of monitoring is done by professionals, and there are sensors everywhere, and things are tracked from outer space and compared against what the government thinks it knows, and then reported out fairly transparently. But in much of the world, there's nothing at all like that. No piece of that process exists. And where it does, it's not necessarily transparent. So instead of letting the world's governments decide what they're going to say about themselves and what they're going to commit to every few years, and then wait another few years before any good new information can be brought into effect, getting citizens involved can actually make it so that that process is just ongoing, and we innovate and we update and we, you know, we upgrade our operating system as frequently as possible. Multi-level collaborative institutions. You may have noticed the 17th Sustainable Development Goal is about partnerships. It's about multi-level, multilateral partnerships. What that means is partnerships that cross borders, that involve multiple partners, but also at different levels. So individual citizens, community groups, municipalities, national governments, UN agencies can all partner. Businesses can as well. We want to see those kind of institutions being designed so that there can be real on-the-ground community leadership, where people like you can have a say in how these kind of policies are put into effect in their communities in places like Nigeria and Bangladesh and Nepal. Carbon pricing, we're going to bring back the core principles of the Pathway to Paris project. We're going to modify the language a little bit because we want to see some of that language work its way into something produced by the COP22 if possible. We'd like to see a legal decision by the COP that says that a welcoming environment for climate finance includes a carbon price. Because even though that's just words, it will be legally decided by 195 countries, and that will bring the weight of law to bear when policymakers decide, okay, how do I get to 30% decarbonization within 5 years? Maybe I should have a carbon price and attract some investment. Everyone else in the world has already agreed that that's the standard, so I can follow that standard. The world is entering into a period where the next couple of years are going to involve that literary workshop that you saw in the Bonn climate negotiations in Germany. That literary workshop is going to be all of the countries of the world working together to produce a collective voice that will provide guidance to individual countries in terms of how can they interpret their obligations under the Paris Agreement, how can they write laws that follow their own internal legal system, but also follow the standards of the international system. That guidance can include language that directs policymakers towards the idea that carbon dividends are a new kind of tool or a different kind of tool that does things other than simply decarbonize or punish polluters or price carbon. Carbon dividends actually help to build local economies. That yellow graph that you saw from Remy is an example of how that story can be told. And then climate resilient investment, we want to see the NDCs, the national climate plans, rooted in local development that is low carbon and is also generative of added local capacity, meaning there's not just more activity and some people somewhere making money, but people there in the places where the activity is happening are actually becoming more economically capable. They're accumulating more influence. They're accumulating more technical capability, better education, better quality of life, living standards, and more political transparency. We want to see all those things get built into these comprehensive strategies. And then business model innovation is a very important piece of this whole thing. Companies need to be able to see how their business model will be radically different in just a couple of years and how they can continue being the same people in the same offices doing something that fits their culture. Their culture will evolve, but their business model can actually evolve faster. And so this is an emerging discussion, and there are things that can be done in and next to the negotiating process to facilitate that. So we're going to work on that as well. And then we want to push this idea that local empowerment, whether it's citizen engagement, whether it's carbon dividends, whether it's the SDGs and the focus on education, but local empowerment is a way of facilitating the race to the top in terms of you as a country being a better performer, a more competitive country, both economically and also in terms of your climate ambition. And I think that this list of ideas is going to be threaded throughout the negotiation process in Marrakesh and also throughout the following year. And so we want to sort of have our fingers on the pulse of that, work together as a team, share as much information as we can with all of you, and see if we can't make something really good out of this this global Congress that happens once a year, and that's going to keep happening. It doesn't end with the Paris Agreement. The COP is a global legislative body that comes together where every country is represented and all people are either directly or indirectly represented. We're trying to make it more direct, have more connectivity there. And I just wanted to add one more thing that we're going to do in order to push in the direction of all these things, which is next Friday on November 4th, the day that the Paris Agreement will officially come into legal force, enter into force. We're going to host a 2-hour webinar on climate smart finance to drive local action. And it's a little bit complicated, some of the policy that's behind it, but the simple fact is there's now a big movement underway among governments, among international institutions, in the Climate Action Network, among economists, to not just think about, but also to map out step by step how we shift all of the trillions of dollars in assets that are tied up in the global financial system into climate resilient priorities. And so that's going to be the focus of our conversation for 2 hours next week. We have some very important guests joining us, and we hope you will too.